Let us now talk about the poorest of the poor. So those people who are really at the very bottom, and there are some interesting documentaries and reconstruction shows that address this thing. So the first thing is the documentary, again a two-part documentary called Secrets from the Workhouse. We, I guess, mentioned the workhouses already, but this institution was introduced in the 1830s, and apparently it survived until well into the 20th century, with some modifications, happily. So the original Victorian workhouses were gradually changed into some sort of modern care centers for the orphans, for the invalids, for the old people who are unable to work. So they developed into something, let's say, like orphanages, or sometimes even hospitals, because especially in the second half of the 19th century, workhouses were the places where very poor people could obtain some form of health care for free, so they didn't have to pay for it. So one of the major reasons why people wanted to go to the workhouse, because nobody was sent there. You had to apply, and they might turn you down, and this was even worse than being accepted, was ill health or some accident or some other problem related to health rather than poverty. So these were things that were closely related. So in The Secrets from the Workhouse, a two-part documentary, some celebrities, including the granddaughter of Charlie Chaplin, visit the buildings that used to serve as workhouses, and they talk and discover their family histories. These were usually people who had very poor background, and apparently, something I didn't know, Charlie Chaplin spent some time as a child in a workhouse because his mother was too poor and too ill to look after him and his brother. Yes, and then he had this wonderful film career and made a lot of money, and even rescued his mother from some sort of pauper's hospital and brought her to America. So he lived out her life in luxury. So what we have is, of course, the crowded living conditions in cities. Very high child mortality and bad living conditions in crowded rooms. So of course the poor had lots of children, very small living space. In one of the cases discussed in this documentary, one of the actors of Scottish descent goes to Glasgow to visit a house where his ancestors lived, and he learns that the rooms they had were so small and there were so many people living in the rooms that one of the members of the family, an elderly mother-in-law, had to actually sleep on the staircase rather than in the room, because there was basically no place to squeeze her in. So rather drastic stories. Also, women came to the workhouse to give birth to illegitimate children, and there was a massive stigma and social prejudice against unmarried mothers. They might pretend to be widows, but if they were abandoned women, and especially women who were not married and left with illegitimate children, this was a very bad situation both for the women and the children. The system of the workhouse basically divided the inmates, the people who applied, into good and bad, into, let's say, deserving and undeserving poor, and the treatment of these groups, which were very, I would say, subjective, and depended on the health of the person, the age, the life history, any, I don't know, mental problems or alcoholism, of course, deemed you as unworthy from the very beginning. So this all was very subjective and very relative, and the kind of work that you did without pay, of course, just for shelter and food and some clothes, was heavy and bad and basically quite horrible. Two more very interesting documentaries or kind of reconstruction shows. One is called 24 Hours in the Past. And you have again a group of celebrities, including even a conservative politician, an elderly lady who's a conservative politician. They volunteer to spend 24 hours in 4 locations. So it's a kind of live show. So the first location they go to is the dust yard. So they do all those scavenging jobs that are described by Henry Mayhew and other government reports or things like that. So they have to clean the dust yard and look for anything valuable, including the dog poo. Yes, some of them actually have to go and look for dog poo among horse manure. It's all in Bliss Hill town, which is a kind of reconstructed Victorian town. Again, a wonderful place to visit. If you remember another BBC reconstruction show called The Victorian Pharmacy, it was filmed there by the same team who did Full Steam Ahead and The Victorian Farm, among other things. So the first thing they do is the dust yard. Then they have the coaching inn, because in spite of the growth of the railways, the horse-drawn coaches were still used for traveling, and they were operating a system of a kind of hotels or guest houses that worked with the carriage lines, and there they work in a coaching inn, so they have to work very quickly to serve the people who come in the coach. They want to eat something, and they have to change the horses so that the coach can leave on time. Then they work in the potteries, so a version of industrial work. Again, a very interesting place in central England called Gladstone Potteries. No, I guess no relation to the famous Prime Minister. So still working manufacture of ceramic goods, of pans, not pots and pans, cups and plates and such things. So they have to work there for a day, and the last 24 hours, they have to spend in a workhouse. Of course, a recreated workhouse with deliberately very unpleasant stuff, that is, well, actors playing the stuff, and they have to survive there. If you're interested how they deal with that, especially this conservative politician lady who strongly believed in Victorian values and believed, well, as the Victorian conservatives did, that the poor should just work harder, and this is an interesting thing to see. And the last thing I'd like to recommend to you is another reconstruction show from the BBC called The Victorian Slum, or The Victorian Slum House. 5 episodes with a group of volunteers, no celebrities here, but they stay longer. They have to stay for 5 weeks. And week after week they stay in a different decade, in a reconstructed Victorian slum. So everything, very poor housing, some old house that was basically renewed in such a style, with a lot of mud in the courtyard and privy to share among, I don't know, 20 people or more. And they have to work. They have to work for the rent. If they cannot pay the rent, they are downgraded. They go to worse accommodation. The worst available accommodation is a so-called DOS house, which was a kind of shelter for the night for the very poor who could pay 4 pence to spend a night in something called a coffin bed. So like a kind of, it's like a coffin-shaped sleeping quarters with some straw thrown in, or even less, 2 pence for the so-called hangover benches or penny hangs. So they sit on a bench protected by a rope, and they have to spend the night sitting down. This is the only way they can do it. So we have those volunteers, and they try to meet the required deadlines by mostly working from home, as very many Victorian poor people did. So they make artificial flowers, or they make matchboxes, or some, I don't know, present boxes or whatever. One of the volunteers is the family of a skilled tailor, so he kind of gradually goes up the scale by very hard work, by making clothes or altering clothes, also using old clothes to make something new to sell. Then there is a family of shopkeepers who operate a shop for the slum dwellers. This is very interesting. This is really, there's a lot of historical information given about the reality of the life of the poor in the 19th century. So week by week they go from the 1860s through the 70s, 80s, 90s to the Edwardian period, so the 1900s. It's not always that the next week and the next decade brings improvement. Sometimes it does. I would say that eventually the comparison of the living conditions from the 1860s to the 1900s shows big improvement, but it's not very linear at times. Especially in the 70s, there was a big economic crisis. In the 80s, there was a lot of immigration from Ireland, from continental Europe. For example, the Jews coming from the Russian Empire, fleeing from persecution and the pogroms. So we have all these things really represented in this program. Very interesting, although it actually gets me very sad. Yesterday I watched the entire thing. I watched 5 hours of the Victorian slum. Don't try to do it at home. Watch it perhaps slower, because it's quite saddening. And especially you can see that these people were really trying hard, and some of them were just not coping because the system made it impossible for them to cope. There is one guy who's missing half a leg. Well, really, he lost it in some sort of accident, and now he's trying to adjust to the Victorian conditions. There is a single mother with twins, around 10-year-old twins, so she has to work like twice as much to feed herself and the children. There are some immigrants, some Irish and Jewish, and even one Polish guy who comes there as an immigrant. Most of the people, when they were asked why they did it and why they basically involved in this recreated slum experience for so long, they said that they wanted to reconnect with their own family histories, that they knew that their ancestors lived in East End in London. This was filmed in the East End, and basically recreated the life conditions there. So they wanted to kind of reappreciate their great grandparents and other ancestors, and basically this is what they said in the end. They really respected the people who managed to crawl out of the slum, who managed to better themselves. They understood how much work was involved and how difficult it was, and how easy it was to be swept away by the system. So of course they could rely on some charity, but sometimes this charity is strange. Like in the where was it, in the 90s or in the 80s, there is slum tourism. So people come to to watch the poor, like, you know, the animals in the zoo. So they kind of could earn a bit more money by posing for the tourists or selling some small things for the tourists, but they all agreed this was very humiliating, and so yeah, I guess that's it. If you want more, the first thing to do is of course read the chapter from Sally Mitchell's book. If you got interested in any aspect of work in Victorian period, try to find these documentaries. I found them with no problem on the internet, or we can talk about it during the live meet. Thank you.